Good afternoon. I'm Tiffany Miller, Vice President at R&J Strategic Communications, and thank you for joining us today for our Reputation Management in a Digital World webinar. As recent headlines show, a crisis can happen to any business at really any given time. Today's digital landscape has also created an environment where information tends to move at breakneck speed, making it more important than ever for companies to protect their reputation. Today, you will hear from several top executives here at R&J who will provide insight on how to prepare for a crisis, how to recognize one as early on as possible, and what steps you can take to help your organization to weather a crisis. I see we have a number of our clients joining today, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, I give you this brief plug. We are a 30-year-old marketing communications firm. We help companies ranging from divisions of large multinational conglomerates to regional market leaders to build market share and to aggressively defend their market position. Along the way, we've helped a number of our clients to weather significant crises in industries as diverse as healthcare, consumer products, financial service firms, industrial B2B clients, companies, and nonprofits. What we'll cover in the next 40 minutes is now on the screen in front of you. And during the presentation, we certainly encourage everyone joining us today to ask questions. So if you have any questions, please submit them via the questions box, and we'll address them as we go along. But should note that we've also allocated time at the end for Q&A. Our discussion today will be led by John Lonsdorf, President, Scott Marioni, Executive Vice President, and Tim Juris, Director of Digital Services. Sorry, Tim, totally messed up your last name. And John's going to get us started now as we jump into what is a crisis.
Thank you, Tiffany, and good afternoon, everyone. I think, first of all, we can all agree that managing a company's reputation is and has to be job one. Many otherwise good companies with good employees and good products have failed because their inability to form, nurture, and protect their reputation. And that's what this webinar is all about. Consumers, and that includes even if you're on the B2B side, B2B consumers, they're really loath to do business with a company that they don't believe they can trust or that they don't have confidence in. And as we've seen time and time again, companies that fail to anticipate a crisis or actually mishandle a crisis situation when it arises can be slow to recover and are often diminished as a result. The famous Warren Buffett once famously said, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and only 5 minutes to ruin it." If you're responsible for a business in any way, shape, or form, if you own it or are responsible, those have to be chilling words to you, that things can come crashing down that quickly. Every organization is vulnerable to a crisis, and if you're not prepared, you could incur substantial damage. So what is it that constitutes a crisis? Well, there's no easy answer to that question, obviously. Think of a crisis as any event or a series of events that pose a potential threat to your business operations, your profits, or significantly to your brand reputation. And that's really important. It isn't just about revenues, it's about your brand reputation. And crises happen all the time. They can be accidental, things like, a fire or on-the-job injury, or even, God forbid, a death. Or they can be caused by things like malfeasance, internally by an employee or a manager. And in this day and age, we're all well aware of the claims of sexual harassment and sexual assault. They're top of mind, and that constitutes a crisis. Or they can be externally caused, things like a theft, a robbery, a misuse of your product, one that we've handled on a number of occasions also. And even something as seemingly simple as a bad online review or perhaps an online troll with a bone to pick against your company who just rants, and eventually that can go viral and also damage your reputation. So in today's day and age, and this is actually frightening, a crisis can start with a simple post on any number of social platforms. But I guess the point is a crisis that can happen any time and anywhere. It behooves you to be ready and have a plan in place to quickly recognize the potential crisis and to have specific actionable steps in mind and in place to counteract that. So no organization should be without a crisis communication plan. And although every crisis is different, almost all crises have a few consistent elements which you can plan for in advance. And to that point, I'm going to turn it over now to Scott Marioni, Executive Vice President, who's going to talk about a recent crisis situation that's currently in the news. and it's going to we're going to use that to frame our discussion going forward. Scott?
All right, thanks, John. As John mentioned, a lot of what we're going to talk about today in terms of how to prepare for and address and navigate a crisis is sort of academic in nature, so we thought it would be helpful to use a concrete example, a real-world example, to sort of frame the discussion and give us a point of reference that we can refer back to throughout the course of the discussion in talking about how to navigate a crisis. So we chose the Starbucks situation, which is, I was going to say, the recent Starbucks crisis, but it is not necessarily still a crisis, but still an unfolding situation for a number of reasons. First, it's obviously a very timely, high-profile situation. We figured everybody would be at least a little bit familiar with it. Second, it's a very good example of how a crisis can happen and very quickly escalate in today's fragmented digital communications landscape. And third, it's a great example of how quickly a crisis can become an existential threat, even to a brand as big as Starbucks. Starting with something that is seemingly small and just a few years ago wouldn't have had the same opportunity to escalate and pose that kind of threat. So there's a great deal of detail that we could go into. We won't have time to go into with respect to this specific example today, but we're going to address it from a 30,000-foot perspective, focusing specifically on how the crisis happened and the specific steps that Starbucks took in addressing it from a communications perspective. So we've got a brief timeline that we've put together to illustrate the crisis, and really the bulk of this unfolded over the span of 6 days in April. It started on April 12th, when two African-American men were sitting in a Starbucks cafe in Philadelphia, waiting for a third individual with whom they had a meeting planned. They hadn't bought anything. One of the men asked if he could use the restroom, was told that he couldn't by a store manager, and that they would have to leave the store unless they were going to buy something. When the men sat back down, didn't leave the store, the manager called 911. The police were brought in. They handcuffed, arrested the men, and held them for several hours before releasing them without filing any charges. Just so happens that a woman named Melissa DePino was sitting in that cafe and filmed the entire incident with her phone and posted to Twitter. She happened to have a substantial following, predominantly among people who are interested in and engaged around issues including social justice and racial inequality and things of that nature. So very quickly, basically, all hell broke loose when that tweet was posted. There were protests at the store, there was outrage, there was media coverage, and there was a great deal of dialogue around the idea that this incident actually represented Starbucks' institutional racist values, when in fact, Starbucks spends a great deal of time telling you that that is the exact opposite of who they are and what they stand for. So 2 days after the incident, Starbucks issued their initial response in the form of an apology on the website and that same apology via a tweet using owned and shared media. That was a very brief statement acknowledging the issue, acknowledging the fact that they needed to do better and promising to look into the situation. The following day, they turned again to owned media and their website for the CEO to post a much longer, more involved statement, both in writing and in video, in which he said that the incident was reprehensible, that it was not consistent with Starbucks values, in which he took full accountability as the CEO for the incident, not allowing blame to be deflected to the store manager, saying very clearly instead that this was an issue of policy that he needed to review and look into, and it was on him to change policies and to do better and to act in accordance with Starbucks values, which were about being that third place, a place of community outside your home and your work where you could meet, convene, relax, and enjoy a cup of coffee, presumably without being arrested and held for several hours without being charged. The following day, the Starbucks CEO, Kevin Johnson, turned to earned media for the first time and did an appearance on Good Morning America from via satellite. He was in Philadelphia. During that appearance, he mentioned that he and several other Starbucks executives were in Philly, meeting with the mayor, the police commissioner, other community leaders, and he promised to meet specifically with and apologize directly to those two men face to face and map out a plan for moving forward with their involvement. The following day, the 17th, he turned to earned and owned media again. The earned media was an appearance with Don Lemon on CNN, during which he reiterated everything that he had reiterated prior to meeting with the men, again took responsibility, again talked about their plan moving forward and pledged that he would work with the individuals involved. The next event was actually an appearance on CNBC, another earned media appearance, during which he talked about the incident in the context of quarterly earnings, which was actually very interesting. He wasn't forced to do so, but he worked it into the conversation, did a very good job of talking about the incident and how it hadn't necessarily affected store sales, but that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was they got this right, that they got back in line with their cultural values, and that they did the right thing moving forward. And then finally, later on in May, they announced the settlement, again via their website, with the two men involved, and the city of Philadelphia actually issued a statement that same day as well, talking about their settlement. So that is the crisis and how it unfolded in a nutshell. When you get the presentation when you get the deck after the webinar, each of the items represented on the timeline is a link to those specific materials, video clips or press releases or statements. So you'll have a chance to click through and see all those materials for themselves to get a better sense of how they specifically handled this. But not every crisis, obviously, is as big and all-consuming as the Starbucks example. So I'm going to turn it back to John, talk a little bit more about types of crises that you might face and how you can prepare for those in your everyday business.
Thanks, Scott. I think we can all agree that there's no way in the world that Starbucks could have anticipated that exact type of crisis that befell them. But the important thing to remember is this, and as I say to our clients all the time, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when a crisis of some proportion is going to happen in your company. So one of the biggest mistakes that companies make in a crisis situation is to engage in wishful thinking, thinking that there's some special or powerful thing or tactic that they can do, say, or implement that'll magically make a crisis go away. And I guess, truth be told, sometimes a quick, compassionate, unexpected response, can turn a crisis into an opportunity. But those situations are few and far between. And my advice is don't count on that. Be prepared to act quickly when a crisis is identified. The good news about crises, though, is that many company crises never get reported in the traditional press, and most don't flame up on social media. And sometimes that happens only because the story is really not newsworthy, or, as I said, sometimes you get lucky and it flies under the radar screen. But usually it happens because a company has handled the situation skillfully from the beginning, and skillfully enough that it never really became anything that was visible to the press or flamed up. And the lesson that we take out of those situations is that, again, being thoughtful, being accurate, being compassionate, being honest is often the driver of success. And that leads to messaging, which Scott is going to talk about in a little bit, but I'm going to keep talking for now. Other times, a crisis may be significant enough that it's both newsworthy and gets attention. And here's where preparation comes in and takes its place now before the crisis hits. Often a company's ability to successfully manage whether a crisis is something that hurts them dramatically is directly proportional to the balance of what they have in what I like to call the bank of goodwill. And if you take nothing more from this webinar, take this to heart. Your customers, your stakeholders, the general public, people who are concerned about your situation are going to be far more willing to give you the benefit of the doubt and to listen to your messages in a crisis if your company has a good reputation for doing the right thing, if you have a hefty balance, as it were, in that bank of goodwill. Customers' positive experience with your brand and the reputation that you've built are all strong factors in gaining the benefit of the doubt, even in situations where, frankly, you may be at fault. But if the crisis is something that the public views as out of character for your company, like going back to Starbucks in that situation, that was out of character for the company. They're far more likely to retain their favorable opinion and give you the benefit of the doubt. They say, okay, well, things happened and this was one of those things. Keep in mind that the Bank of Goodwill has several different branches, if I can stretch that metaphor just a little bit more. The media who cover your industry are very likely to be among those who are potentially reporting about a crisis when it happens in your situation, in your company. So work on your media relationships now. Don't wait until your back is against the wall to try to create a favorable relationship with an industry journalist. And I'm not saying that you have to be overly solicitous, or anything like that. Just just try to be friendly, to have a good relationship, be open and helpful to the people who cover your industry, and it'll come back to help you much later on down the road if you need it. So work on that bank of goodwill, but always be vigilant. If you haven't yet, at the very least, you need to set up Google alerts that can deliver early warning signals on things that affect your company or perhaps your key executives or your products. And also don't forget to track industry terms as well. Because a crisis that can affect your company can emanate from just about anywhere. It can emanate from a competitor or from something that happens in your industry. Better yet, make sure you include these names and key terms in the media monitoring that you should be doing, or perhaps your public relations agency is doing it for you. And also assign somebody to monitor social channels. One of the things that came out of the Starbucks is that this is a crisis that emanated from social media. By monitoring the social media channels, you get the early warning signs of a crisis that may be coming, that may be building.
And just to chime in on that point, if we look at the Starbucks example, the original tweet in question that was shared that precipitated this entire event has been viewed now in the last month more than 11 million times, and it has been shared more than 170,000 times and with 236,000 likes. So this is clearly something that from that single tweet blossomed into a national story. And not that it necessarily could have been prevented, but by doing that monitoring early on, you can kind of anticipate things that may become a problem and start your crisis intervention early.
Hey, that was Tim Gertis, our Director of Digital Services, who has all of these numbers at his fingertips and is really the numbers whiz. We're happy to have him on board with us. So the final point I want to make regarding the slide that's in front of you now is that you need to insist on company-wide transparency. Just make sure that everybody in your company knows that they need to report any potential issues that they see, anything that they see that's kind of out of the ordinary, report it to their immediate supervisor. I like to tell people that bad news is far more like fish than it is fine wine. It tends to get worse and worse as time goes on, not better. So an early warning can be a difference maker in rolling out an effective crisis response. Okay, now what do you do when you smell, suspect, or worse, get slapped in the back of the head with a crisis? Well, hopefully you've had the foresight to develop a crisis management plan that includes a series of protocols, the what do we do when a crisis happens to us plan, as I call it. At the first inkling of a crisis, we're going to tell you that you need to err on the side of caution. Activate stage 1 of your crisis management plan, hoping that that's as far as you're going to need to get with it, but go ahead and do that. Alert key members of your team that something's happened, that there might be something percolating, just kind of get everybody's radar moving in the right direction. And if you have the right crisis management protocols in place, this is going to set in sight some of your response preparation, the gathering of information, the activation of certain roles within the plan, and the beginning of a response strategy. That in the best of all circumstances, hopefully you're not really going to need, but be ready for it. And here's something that many companies don't anticipate when a crisis hits. During a crisis, you still need to be able to do business. Far too often, the crisis committee at a company consists of everyone in the top management structure, and they neglect the fact that someone has to continue to make the donuts, so to speak. So resist the temptation to say everybody's on the crisis management team. Know that someone has to be there to continue to shovel coal into the company furnace. So that's enough for me for now. Let me turn it back to Scott, who's going to talk about what I believe is the most important aspect of a good crisis response, and that's good, sound messaging. Scott?
Yeah, so messaging is critically important. Having a clear, consistent message that represents your company's values, your point of view, and articulates a path forward is critically important to successfully navigating and moving beyond a crisis. But I just want to take a half a step back and say that before you get your messaging in order and you engage with any external audiences, it is critically important, more important maybe, to start with fact gathering, to make sure that you do your research, that you conduct an investigation, that you understand everything about the issue and the nuance around it before you engage outside the organization. The Philadelphia police chief is a good example of not following that advice in connection with the Starbucks issue. He was very quick to come out with a statement and to very clearly and demonstratively say that the police, the officers who were dispatched to that Starbucks acted 100% appropriately and in compliance with protocols, which they may have, but he didn't have all of the information. He didn't have context. He didn't have the nuance that he needed. He apparently didn't realize that the Caucasian people very often sit in a Starbucks for hours on end without buying anything and are granted access to the bathroom and are not handcuffed, arrested, and held for several hours. So in his zeal to support his officers and to tamp down opposition to his organization and his treatment of these individuals, he got out in front of it too quickly, didn't get the facts, and came off looking less than well-informed, which in fact he was, and that didn't work out very well for him. So start with fact gathering, understand all of the nuance and the details around an issue, then get your messages in order and bulletproof, and then engaged. And when you do engage, it's important that you do all the things that are up here on the slide now. Be truthful, be transparent, be relatable, take accountability where it's appropriate and don't dodge. Be mindful of your brand values and speak to them whenever you have an opportunity when you're talking about the crisis, and clearly articulate a path forward. Starbucks has gotten a lot of kudos from pundits and analysts of all sorts for how they handled this crisis, and I think rightfully so. Kevin Johnson did a great job of doing those specific things, all the things that are up there on that slide. And if you click through some of those examples, the media appearances that he did when you get the deck afterwards, you'll see how truthful, accountable, transparent, comprehensive, and relatable he was in all of the media appearances and all of the videos that they did. He did an excellent job of that. So it's a great example to look at. So once you've got your messaging in place, the next question is, what channels should I use to reach my target audience? The short answer to that question is all of the channels where your audience is. It is a very fragmented, very complex communications landscape, as everybody knows, and your constituents are in different places, consuming information from different sources at different times of day, in different formats. It is not as simple as it once was before the social and digital era. It is a very complex media environment. So you need to know ahead of time, to John's point about planning, where your audience is, what the best channels to use to reach them are, and how to best engage with them in advance. Having that plan in place will allow you to identify and use the right channels. So how do you do that? That takes us to the next slide, which is about a model called PESO. PESO stands for Paid, Earned, Shared, and Owned Media. These are generally the spheres of media that you can utilize to reach your constituents in today's media market. Paid is obviously exactly what it sounds like. It's paid media. It's things like advertising, sponsored posts, paid influencer relationships, and lead generation activities. Earned media is what you think of when you think of traditional media relations and public relations. That is earning placements in newspapers, on broadcast, on blogs, on websites that are not paid for, that are thought leadership pieces, that are interviews. You earn your way into the dialogue. Shared is social. That is, to a certain extent, messages that you can control in terms of content that you develop and push out through social, but it is very much a two-way conversation when you're in that shared space, and you need to be prepared to engage with your constituents when you're putting information out there and not just view it as a one-way pipeline. And owned media are things like your website, your collateral, brochures, brand journalism, and things of that nature where you control the message. And it was interesting to see how Starbucks approached these four spheres in dealing with their crisis. They started with owned and shared, went to earned, and paid is really kind of yet to be determined. That's often the tail end of a crisis strategy like this, but we're not entirely sure what Starbucks is doing in that sphere just yet. But I'm going to turn it over to Tim, who's going to talk about those four spheres in the order that Starbucks utilizes.
Thanks, Scott. Basically, we're going to start, as Scott said, with owned media. And in the Starbucks situation, because of the size of Starbucks brand and their existing reputation, they were able to kind of start there and get their messaging out from their own channels. And really, owned media is all of the places online where you have content that you control. So that's generally your website and your social media channels. One of the ways the digital age is really unique here is that it used to be that, you know, people would be finding your brand from traditional media sources. Now, thanks to Google and online research and people's websites, most customers, and this includes B2B customers, are essentially conducting 70%, according to Forrester Research, of a commercial transaction or a buying decision with your brand before they ever reach out to somebody from your brand or reach out to a vendor to purchase your product. So thanks to this digital age, they're doing a lot more research and they're a lot more savvy about your brand than they used to be. This is really why it's critical to make sure that your website has a lot of information to help navigate that crisis. So some of that information is actually brand specific. And again, in the Starbucks case, they were able to use the power of their website to kind of share that information about how seriously they took this issue, some of the steps they were taking to mitigate it, and being able to communicate directly to their consumers without a filter. Another way that you can really successfully use your own website in a situation like this is, you know, John referred earlier to the bank of goodwill, and the idea is that if your brand has an ethos, if you have a brand value or mission that you've articulated, and the crisis is kind of unexpected or not in line with that brand value, by sharing that content and making it available online, people can get the sense that this is, you know, out of character for you and this is not, you know, business as usual. This is particularly important because, according to Nielsen research, we're starting to see that consumers today prefer brands. It's referred to as capitalism of the conscience, the idea that they want to do business with brands that they believe share their values and represent the ideals that they look for in their own lives. So again, by having that kind of information that outlines your brand vision and your philosophy online, and having a crisis is out of character, it still allows you to have that connection and hopefully rebuild that bank of goodwill, as it were, to, you know, reconnect with those people who may have been turned off to you by the crisis. Own content, your website, or maybe an intranet if your company is large enough, can also be really useful by communicating the crisis internally to your employees. And this may come in form of training, you know, coaching them on what they should or should be saying, if they should be saying anything at all, what their role is in communicating this event to their customers or the people that they interact with as a representative of your business. And it also may serve simply to demonstrate to your employees that you are taking this seriously and that you are concerned about your brand's reputation and you want to mitigate the event as quickly as possible. The other thing that we should stress when it comes to a crisis, and particularly owned content, crises don't go away quickly. And the other point that we want to look at is search engine optimization and the idea that you're going to have a lot of content on your website. And if that content is easily shareable and easy to find, it can kind of help to move the crisis out of the top search positions by having other material that you can share as a brand owner. So moving a little bit to the shared media part of this, today we still find that when you're looking at a brand's website, that is still a more trusted form of advertising than anything but a recommendation from a family member or friend. This includes, to date, although we see there's a shift to online product reviews or online company reviews from strangers, and that is getting more play now. But really today, it's family members, friends, then a brand's website, and then all other forms of advertising, the print media, TV, radio, and so forth. But that wisdom of the crowd idea, the fact that those consumers who are digitally savvy, they're doing a lot of research on your brand online, and they're starting to take the inputs of other consumers or the collective, the wisdom of the crowd, more seriously. You know, and I think it's important when we look at social or we look at shared media There's a famous quote that's usually attributed to Mark Twain. It says, "A lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on." And we're not suggesting that your customers are lying about you, but the idea is the smallest incident in today's media can really blossom very quickly, and by that sharing power, kind of has the same power as a lie, where the shared collective wisdom about what's happened can actually turn viral before your brand ever has a chance to respond. And if we look at the Starbucks example again, I mean, here's a perfect situation where, because a consumer happened to be in the store with a cell phone that had a camera and she was savvy enough to record it, it's unlikely before social media that this situation where two African-American men were, wrongfully detained by the police simply for sitting at a table and wanting to use the restroom, it's unlikely that that would have been anything but a regional story, and it likely wouldn't have had the national pull if it hadn't been for social media and that online video. So, again, in the digital age, it's important to be monitoring your brand and seeing how people are reacting to your brand out there, engaging in that social listening, and making sure, even before a crisis starts, that your brand's reputation is intact and your audience sentiment about your brand remains positive. But that's usually a very good early warning sign that there may be something amiss, or that there's some hostility to your brand when you see these things happening on social media. Again, I can't stress it's important that millennials are aging into the workforce, and they're also aging into the consumer buying segment. They now represent the largest consumer buying segment. They've eclipsed baby boomers. And they are digital natives, and they are accustomed to using the internet and tools to find out about your brand, to communicate their dissatisfaction with your brand, and just to voice their opinions. So, again, we said earlier, it used to be that you would get your message out to channels that you were, maybe friendly reporters, or you had media outlets that you worked with, and you would distribute your message. Today, that's very much a two-way street, and your consumers have as much to say about you as you have to say about yourself. And they're using the channels that they're accustomed to, and the information dispersion that they use to get information out there about you. So really the key point is, you don't want your consumers to define your brand, or your customers to define your brand, without having a response. So social media monitoring, but then also engaging with both critics and people who are champions of your brand online, making sure that the champions are heard, making sure that criticism doesn't go unchecked. If you don't say anything about a criticism, your side of the story isn't being told. And your customers have the power to define your brand today in social media and online, and it's important not to let them define you. Not all criticisms are fair. In fact, a lot of times there may be a situation that is not your fault, or you didn't have any control over, or it may be infactual, or it may be a false statement, or it may not be how things happen. So you really need to get in there and respond to these things, and not let somebody else tell the entire story. You need to tell your side of the story as well. So with that, I think we're going to go over back to Scott, and he's going to talk a little bit more about earned media and how that plays into a crisis.
Yeah, earned media used to be the only, if not the only, the primary way to deal with a crisis situation and disseminate information. It's not that way anymore. But of the four spheres of media that are prevalent these days, earned and shared are the two where you give up most control of the message. So in an earned media situation, interviews that Ken Johnson did, you are going to face reporters who are going to give you tough questions. You may face skepticism. You may face things that are generally unexpected and you're not entirely prepared for. So it is critically important that you do a lot of preparation before engaging via earned media. The first thing you need to do is to assign a spokesperson for earned media. And in an ideal situation, there will be one spokesperson for the organization throughout the duration of a crisis. That's not always possible or appropriate. In some situations, it's more appropriate to have a couple of spokespeople who have different areas of expertise, but limit the number of spokespeople who are speaking on behalf of the brand and the organization as much as possible to ensure that clarity and consistency. Disseminate information as you have it. It's important to provide information to your target audiences as that information is available and as the situation evolves. It's very important not to allow a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. The media loves a vacuum. Social media really loves a vacuum. So if you're not out there, as Tim said, shaping, engaging, and participating in the conversation and shaping the narrative, others will do it for you. And in today's day and age, that's not a good thing. You don't want anybody else controlling the narrative entirely. And engage where your audience will find you. Again, that goes back to the whole theory behind PESO and the fact that you need to know well in advance of a crisis hitting where your audience is, how they consume information, how they engage with you as a brand, and engage them in those places. Not everybody has the luxury that Starbucks has to be able to call up any of the major networks and say, you know, I've got my CEO, what time do you want him to come on? We typically have some more challenges in our media relations initiatives on behalf of smaller clients, so you need to be aware of that and what opportunities are available to you and be prepared to engage where those opportunities exist and through the channels that will best reach and engage your target audience. So I think we're going back to Tim for paid, right?
Yeah. So, you know, when it comes to paid media, I think, you know, an important point here is that if you're talking about a traditional ad campaign, that isn't necessarily a first line defense because it's not necessarily practical to get it launched as quickly as you might need it to be. But we do believe there's an opportunity to have things boosted when it comes to social media content or even Google AdWords, where you can actually have some content about the crisis or your response to the crisis and put some online advertising dollars behind those responses so that people see them and, again, getting your side of the story out there. But really, we think that a paid campaign is what I'd say is cleanup work. You can't necessarily make a crisis go away. You can't necessarily get it off of Google. But the more content that you have out there, the more content that you have that you put ad dollars behind, the more visible and shareable it is, the sooner that kind of bad news will disappear off of the top of a feed. And that's really a digital response, but if you also look at some other large brands, they've been doing a lot with paid after a crisis to rebuild their reputations. A few that have come to mind, BP with the Deepwater Horizon disaster has been doing a lot of paid TV advertising and traditional advertising to kind of help restore their reputation. Wells Fargo is another one who's recently had a number of crises, and they're again, using traditional television and paid advertising to kind of restore that trust afterwards and kind of rebuild that bank of goodwill. Again, we think that's a long-term solution and that the immediate opportunity is really with that paid digital advertising, but all of that should be considered when you're talking about, you know, how to respond to a crisis and how to restore kind of your customers' faith in your brand. And I think we're going to bring it back to Scott now for some...
No, I'm going to take it, Tim.
Oh, okay.
It's back to John.
Try and stop him.
That's right. So the important thing here is kind of trying to sum up a little bit here. Be prepared as possible as you can to handle a crisis. You need to have a good, solid crisis management plan in place, and you need to revisit it often because things change. You know, your industry changes, people in your company change. The media changes, and you know, as the great philosopher Ferris Bueller famously said, life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it, and you don't want to miss anything in a crisis situation. But you know, obviously, it's difficult to anticipate just what crisis might befall your company. There's really virtually no way that Starbucks could have predicted exactly what would happen in Philadelphia. But as Scott pointed out, their preparation for some sort of crisis, knowing that something was going to happen, did serve them very well, and as a result, the incident that could have had a devastating impact on their business was managed and handled pretty skillfully. So once the crisis subsides, though, it's important to review what happened. Use the knowledge and information that you've gained from having gone through the crisis so you can better prepare for the next time. Assess the damage that's been done, certainly, both externally to your brand, and this is really important, also internally among your employees. A lot of people forget that. You need to work to repair any vulnerabilities that were uncovered and exposed because of the crisis. And, as Tim just got finished saying, in the digital age, information never completely disappears on the internet. So you need to constantly be monitoring and doing things to rebuild your bank of goodwill. And most importantly, ask yourself the difficult questions at the end of a crisis. Was the crisis the result of something, a much larger problem within your organization that maybe you could have or should have recognized? What could you have done better to anticipate that a crisis was happening? What steps can we take to prevent a similar crisis in the future? And, so what I'm saying is resist the temptation to just move on, to say, okay, that's behind us, just move on. Take the necessary steps that you need to help insulate, or even in the best of cases, inoculate your firm from a similar crisis in the future. So now, really summing up, take proactive steps to get ahead of a crisis. Make deposits into your bank of goodwill, and be very vigilant in monitoring what's happening, what people are saying about you and your brand on the internet and industry sites and in general news and things like that. Make sure you have a crisis management plan in place with all the protocols and responsibilities clearly defined and put in writing. Resist knee-jerk reactions and responses. Okay, everybody wants to, respond quickly in this day and age. Resist the urge to knee-jerk, because sound, effective messaging delivered in an open, honest, and transparent manner is really essential to helping you to weather the crisis. And we think you should consider all forms of communication in delivering your message. And that would be all different aspects of paid, earned, shared, and owned media that we just kind of went through. And the timely use of the right media tool can really help you to get through a crisis. Make sure you keep your company open for business. Somebody has to keep doing business. And as I said, review, take a look at what you did, learn from it, fix what needs fixing. And I'm going to turn it back to Tiffany, who has collected some questions that hopefully we can get in within the time frame.
So we had a few questions that came through throughout the presentation. We're running up against our time, so I'll pull out a few. If anybody's submitted a question and it's not answered, obviously feel free to reach out to John, Scott, or Tim directly, and there'll be contact information on the following slide for that. But this one I'll direct to Tim. At what point do I stop engaging with people on social media?
I think this is as much an alchemy as a science, but generally the rule would be try and determine whether or not the person is actually looking for a resolution, or they're simply looking to continue to kind of complain and criticize your brand. If you're actually making headway, or you sense that someone is actually looking for you to help them resolve an issue with the crisis, I think kind of taking that process to the point where they feel satisfaction would be the recommendation. But if it's somebody that's just essentially complaining and looking to tarnish you, I think having a publicly visible social media response that other customers could see, that show that you're taking it seriously, and again, that you want to kind of resolve a problem, is good. But I wouldn't go chasing someone who clearly is not doing anything but furthering an argument.
And I'll direct either Scott or John. How transparent, or what should I tell my employees during a crisis?
Good one. Yeah, it is. You need to be careful in that that your employees, as you know, go out. They leave every day at 5 o'clock or whenever, and they go out into the world, and every one of them is a potential conduit of information. It's important that if you're in the midst of a crisis, to tell your employees that only one person speaks for the company, that they don't speak for the company. But to get more to the point of the question, how transparent you should be. You should be as transparent as you can, as is practical for the situation.
Yeah, you certainly need to tell your employees everything that you're going to tell external constituents before you go external with it. Your employees need to be engaged and informed before the rest of the world is, and they also, as John said, need to be made aware of the protocols and restrictions on anybody speaking on the company's behalf.
We'll just take one more. What should I do as a director if I think the board is ignoring signs of an impending crisis?
Another good question. Well, if you're a director, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders, and what you need to do is you need to be as clear as possible that you sense something going on, that there's a potential crisis there, and you need to make it clear. And if the board is ignoring it, you have to make sure that you document that and put it in the hands of the most important people who could do something about it. Again, keep in mind that as a director, your fiduciary responsibility is to the shareholders and not to the other people who are sitting around the boardroom.
That concludes our webinar for today. We hope that you found the information that John, Scott, and Tim provided and the content that they provided helpful and informative. Again, if you have any questions that weren't answered or any questions following the webinar, please feel free to contact them directly. Their contact information is up on the screen in front of you. And if once wasn't enough, or if you wanted to share this with any members of your team, this presentation will be available on demand on our website as well. We thank you for your time and your participation.